Welcome beyond the Reiki Gateway. I'm your host, Andrea Kennedy. Like countless others, Reiki found me when I wasn't even looking, and then it ignited a whole new world of questions. This podcast explores topics of interest for the spiritually curious. Join me for discussions and special guests on subjects such as past lives, crystal healing, spiritual awakening, ascension, energy healing, and more, all to assist and inspire you along your unique soul's journey. Hi, it's Andrea. If you've ever felt a nudge to learn Reiki with me, this might be our moment. I'm coming over to the UK this June, and I'll be teaching a Reiki 1 and 2 class, and then a Reiki master class will be at the beautiful French Partridge Hotel near Northampton. I'm also including for my students a special exclusive event, and we'll share some time together outside of class, and I think that you'll like it very much. I also know that the world feels uncertain right now, and it may be easy to hesitate and put this sort of thing off. But this is exactly when we need to invest in ourselves and take action, because how we grow now will shape how we'll support ourselves and others later. This is no time to sit on the sideline. Spots are limited, and both the classes are now at least halfway full. Go to mainstreamreiki.com to reserve your seat, to learn more about both classes and that exclusive bonus event. I truly hope to see you in June. Welcome to Beyond the Reiki Gateway. I'm Andrea Kennedy, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dawson Church, PhD, who you probably have heard of before. He's a leading voice in the science of transformation, a passionate researcher and best-selling author. His books, including The Genie in Your Genes, Mind to Matter, and Bliss Brain, have explored how thoughts, emotions, and spiritual practices create lasting change in the brain and the body. He's also known for bringing evidence-based tools like EFT or tapping into mainstream use. In his newest book, Spiritual Intelligence, Dawson shows how connecting with something greater, whether through meditation, energy work, or moments of awe, activates our neural network that supports joy, compassion, and resilience. He's here with us right here beyond the Reiki Gateway to show us how changing our consciousness can change our lives and therefore our world. And I'm just so ecstatic that you're here, Dawson. We were talking a little bit about before the show, and I said, it's like I know you. We've never met before, but gosh, there's just a familiarity there. So welcome and thanks for being here.
Often you know someone's energy before you know their body and them in person. So it's interesting to meet people and just feel energetically we're attuned. And there are so many people waking up and being in the space nowadays. So it's wonderful that we're part of this grand community, Andrea.
It really is. And you've been a researcher for so long. You have these books, and I'm sure you have so many different studies and facts and things that go through your mind all the time. And early this morning, I was thinking about our interview, and I wanted to ask you, this is kind of a little odd perhaps, but I'm going to ask you anyway. When you were young, what did you want to be? What did you go to school for early on?
When I was a toddler, I wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to fly a plane. And I think what I wanted to do later on, like as a teenager, realizing that was a metaphor, like I was having flying dreams where without any plane whatsoever, I could fly. And I loved having those dreams. And so I realized our potential in metaphorical ways like flying to soar far beyond the kind of pedestrian consciousness and limited thinking I saw all around me. And I lived in a society and very, very traditional, very conventional. I was raised partly in England, partly in the US, partly in different places. My father was a missionary, so we went all over the place, mostly Southern Africa. And so I had exposure to lots of different cultures, races, countries. And yet I realized human suffering was common to all of them. And so I think part of me wanted as a kid to fly, find a way to be above all of that. And so I got into spirituality when I was like 11 or 12 years old, because I really wanted to find ways of transcending and moving beyond that limited cultural vision that I felt myself embedded in.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I wanted to also ask what you've written books in the past. You've researched all these for decades. Why this book, Spiritual Intelligence? What does that mean? What new frontier are you embarking on and inviting us to join you in?
It's so new, Andrea, that I began working on the book in 2018, but I actually had to throw out more than half the manuscript because of the advances in science that were showing that my original proposition of spiritual intelligence and focusing on the spiritual and religious traditions that brought us spirituality was actually very limited. And what the neuroscience was showing was how neurologically based these spiritual states are. So I actually had to toss more than half the book. That's very painful if you're a writer. You've written these beautiful chapters and you have to hit delete.
That would be really
It's like,
hard.
ah, like taking your garden and pulling up plants. It's so hard. But you want to make sure that you're really focused on what's new, what's current, what's fresh, and also keep your books highly focused and short. And so with spiritual intelligence, I realized that our ability to connect with something higher than oneself, and that is the definition of spiritual intelligence, is our ability as individual human consciousness to engage with something greater than yourself is that definition, and it's highly dependent on neurons. We are physical beings. We have bodies and we have brains and we have nervous systems. And as we engage those in certain ways, our ability to connect with something greater than ourselves, a greater consciousness, a greater energy, increases. And what also starts to happen is that consciousness greater than ourselves connects with us. We open up a channel, a gateway through which we can download information, we can download inspiration. Love just floods into our experience as we develop that connection, and it's mediated by these specific regions in our brain and specific groups of neurons. So the book became about that. And the really surprising finding to me as I read the science was how strongly biologically based spiritual intelligence is. So that's the foundation of the book. I begin with that definition. I have lots of stories in the book as well of people with spiritual intelligence and how that manifests in their lives, how it changes their whole situation when they develop that spiritual intelligence. So there are a lot of stories there, as well as a lot of science. And the book begins, in fact, with the story of a man called Anthony Ray Hinton, who was accused of murder in Alabama many years ago. And because he was black, he was sentenced to life in prison. And he was pursued by a racist district attorney who, despite absolutely clear evidence that he hadn't committed the crimes, he was put away for life. And not only that, the system there was so racist, he was put in solitary confinement. And so for many, many, many years, he spent his whole day in a cell 5 foot by 7 foot, only allowed out for exercise once a day for an hour. And despite that, he never fell prey to hatred or resentment. He mentored other men who were in the prison. He was so kind and compassionate to his guards. They eventually petitioned the governor to have him released. It took many years for his case to wind up through the system because the Alabama Attorney General did not allow his case to be reviewed. The Alabama Attorney General spent 15 years suppressing attempts to get him released. Eventually, he went to the Supreme Court, and within a very short while, they made a unanimous decision that he should be released. And in those 30 years, he was a model of love and kindness. When asked afterwards in an news interview on 60 Minutes, they said, well, aren't you angry about these people, to all these people who put you away for all those years? He said, those people took away 30 years of my life. If I am angry, I will have taken away the rest of my life. So no, I'm not. So I give examples like Anthony Ray Hinton, who are just shining examples of spiritual intelligence throughout history, modern and ancient, and give us a sense of how this changes our lives, even in terrible circumstances. Stories from the Holocaust, stories from early persecution of Christians and Jews, all kinds of examples through history. When we develop this ability to connect with something higher than ourselves, it fills our lives with grace and love, regardless of whether we're in a 5x7 prison cell or living ordinary lives.
That's an interesting account. And as you were talking there, especially at the end, what came to my mind was religion, because hasn't it been the case in modern times where people would say religion or turning to God, did that for them? But what we're talking about is spirituality. And so there's, of course, a difference there. Um, what are the beliefs, or what is the framework around spiritual intelligence? Is there dogma? Is there certain things that have to be done? Um, I don't know. What would you say to that?
There's been a massive movement in the 20th and 21st centuries away from organized religion and towards spirituality. And the largest denomination, the largest religion right now in the Western world is spiritual but not religious. And these are ex-Jews, ex-Catholics, ex-Buddhists, ex-Hindus who've left conventional religion and have turned to being spiritual but not using that religious framework. And the religious framework often becomes oppressive and very strict and suppressive. And so they have rules, they have structures. They may have been useful rules, 10,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, but a lot of religion is not all that useful to us now. So many people are finding they have spiritual awakenings independent of religion. And then if we go back to the origin of all the religions, go back, 2,500 years ago to the Buddha and 2,000 years ago to Jesus and earlier to Vedanta and Hinduism in India. And what we find was at the beginning, at the start of every religion, whether it was, whether it was Muhammad's night journey, where he had these visions of the Archangel Gabriel showing him heaven, whether it was Jesus 40 days in the wilderness, whether it was Buddha under the Bodhi tree, we find that at the origin point of every religion, there was a mystical experience, that the person had this mystical experience. Their spiritual intelligence brought their individual human consciousness into oneness with cosmic consciousness. And the word we use nowadays in scholarly work is non-duality, that the barriers between me as an individual consciousness dissolve and I become one with infinite consciousness. Rumi said, we are not a drop in the ocean of consciousness. We are the ocean of consciousness in a drop. And so we have that experience, that mystical experience. And then Moses comes down from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments and tries to explain them to people, or Jesus leaves the wilderness and tries to explain it. And so these different cultural contexts, different timelines, these religions look very, very different. Some are monotheistic, some are polytheistic, some, like Buddhism, just talk about the void and the infinite and no actual personal God at all. And yet they all have as their origin point that mystical experience, and that's where we come together. So when I am traveling and meeting people of different faiths, and we're mystics, we're all in touch with cosmic consciousness, we're all at oneness. It doesn't really matter what religious trappings you have. And that's the way the religions relate to spiritual intelligence. They all have as their origin point that mystical experience. And you don't need a lot of the religious trapping. You don't need this, what in the Episcopal Church when I was growing up, we called it smells and bells, because they ring a bell during communion and there's incense. And, we don't need all the saffron robes and the prayer beads and the rosaries and the malas. I mean, you can use those things if you want to, if they bring you to that sense of feeling one. But the crucial thing is, can you, as you breathe, as you meditate, as you're in awe, as you're listening to music, as you're with a spiritual teacher, can you let go of your the illusion that you are this individual human being, divorced from nature, divorced from the universe, divorced from the great cosmic scheme of life, and you're just bumping along here? Or can you release that limited human ego and then merge with the all that is? Because that's where you find love, grace, blessing, beauty, and your brain then, and that's what spiritual intelligence shows us. In my book, I talk about the brain changes that happen, and they are pervasive, they are massive, and they begin happening within the first 30 days.
Yeah, that is what I would really like to get into because you mentioned biology earlier, and we have known, I think forever that the mystical experiences, that sort of thing, that can be so transformative for the individual. But it seemed that, it was here and there or random or happening, just by chance kind of thing. And so, what you're inviting us to do, if I'm correct in this, is to actually develop a practice where we strengthen our spiritual intelligence and then we see measurable change. Is that correct?
In chapter 2 of Spiritual Intelligence, I begin the chapter in a funny way of me trying many, many years ago, working out in the gym, trying to bench press 200 pounds. So there I was. I'm really skinny. I'm really tall. And so I had this goal. I was going to bench press 200 pounds. I had it on my vision board. I was a bench press. I was affirming I could bench press 200 pounds. I was going into the gym and I was bench pressing like initially 150, then 160. But despite all my visualization and my affirmation and my belief, I couldn't, because I didn't have enough muscle fibers. And the average man's biceps are about 12 inches around. And if you have 12-inch biceps, you can't bench press 200 pounds. You need about 13-inch biceps to bench press 200 pounds. And so eventually I built up my biceps. And it took me a long, long, long time, many, many months, more than a year in the gym to build up enough muscle fibers to bench press 200 pounds. And the point I make in that part of the book is that all my belief, all the placebo effect, all of my affirmation could not result in me bench pressing 200 pounds until I had enough muscle fibers in my biceps and they grew. The same way with spiritual intelligence, you have to practice spiritual intelligence. That means meditation, that means compassion, that means kindness, that means all kinds of practices that you implement in your life. And that's how you're bench pressing your way up to spiritual intelligence and these mystical states. You build neurons. And the good news that I share is that, eventually in my story, eventually I bench pressed and practiced enough time. One day I went from 195 to 200 pounds, and I did it because I generated a lot more muscle fibers in my biceps. And what I share then with people is the research in chapter 2, that it doesn't take years with spiritual intelligence. I've done a randomized controlled trial of a meditation method I pioneered called eco meditation, which uses heart coherence and tapping and self hypnosis and several evidence based techniques together. And in eco meditation, what we found in a randomized controlled trial using magnetic resonance imaging, MRI technology, is that in 30 days, you build enough new neural circuits by exercising those circuits to where you can catapult into those transcendent states in only 30 days. So we measured structural and functional change in the brain in only a month. And that's how quickly you build the neurons. And as those neurons fire together, they wire together. And suddenly, within a month, you find yourself moving into these elevated states. And then you're downloading all of that love, all of that joy, all of that grace. You're highly motivated to keep on going. And the brain change process progresses from there. After a year, your brain has changed dramatically. Structures like the hippocampus for memory and learning and emotion regulation have grown. Structures like the orbitofrontal cortex involved in attention have grown. Ventromedial prefrontal cortex, part of the brain involved in emotion regulation, regulating negative emotion. That part of the brain gets a lot bigger in people after a while doing effective meditation. So you are literally remodeling your brain, and it doesn't take those years it took me to bench press 200 pounds. It starts, we can measure it in an MRI study in 30 days.
And so that's remarkable. In 30 days, and then how long each day? Is it just a meditation that they're doing every day, or are there other things that they're also doing?
They were doing a meditation every day for a month, and the meditation was 22 minutes long. And there are studies showing that even 8 minutes of a meditation can produce some brain change. 12 minutes produces a little bit more. We find that 22 minutes is a good length because you can settle in deeply in that time. It's harder to do in a very, very brief meditation. So it can be effective. I mean, if I'm in the grocery store and there's a long line, I have two options. I can get really impatient. It's my middle name, Dawson, Impatient Church. And I can go to the impatient middle part of my name. Or I can sit there and breathe and meditate. And even just that, 25 breaths is going to do me some good. So brief meditations are fine, but you want to really give your body a chance to settle in, and you want to fire those neurons enough to wire them together. And that takes that 20 plus minutes a day to accomplish.
And can you do 11 in the morning and 11 at night? Is that just as good?
Well, what we find happens is that in my previous book, Bliss Brain, I talk about the neurochemicals of ecstasy. And so when you do this, you're generating a flood of dopamine in your brain. The dopamine in the brains of meditators can rise up to 65%. And that's a huge rise in dopamine, your motivation reward neurotransmitter. So you're feeling like incredibly motivated at that point with that 65% rise in dopamine. Your oxytocin goes up a lot, the love hormone. Your serotonin, the satisfaction neurotransmitter, rises. Anandamide, the bliss neurotransmitter, goes up. So you're having all of these exquisite neurotransmitters in your brain. And so you are far less likely to be asking the question. It'd be like, saying, okay, how can I have less sex? How can I have less fun? How can I have less fun in my life? Yeah, I'm only having a half hour fun every day. Can I cut that down to 10 minutes?
Right. Yes. Yes.
It's saying more like, oh, goodness, this is half an hour of ecstasy. I want an hour.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. And I guess I asked the question because people are just under an illusion sometimes, or believing that, they don't have any time. But I mean, really, 22 minutes is nothing. I mean, it's really not. It goes by in a blink of an eye. I mean, we could scroll on social media and 22 minutes goes by so quickly. So it's not a lot of time invested. That that is true.
When
Um,
people tell me they don't have time, I mean, I've heard that from people for decades, and I would have said the same thing earlier myself. And so I did a study to answer that very question. I thought, what happens to people's productivity when they do eco meditation? And these were people taking a very simple course I offer called the 21-day walk with your higher power. And we recommend people use a higher power. It's a little hard to connect with an amorphous thing like cosmic consciousness, but it's very easy to connect with your higher power, and people can do that very easily. It's not hard to invite your higher power in. When you invite your higher power in, your higher power shows up there for you big time right away, and it's just often been waiting to shower you with its blessings and have you give the time to the relationship. So we have people do that 21-day walk with your higher power, and we measured their productivity when they began the course and when they ended the course in under a month. And we found that between point A and point B, their productivity at home and work went up 20%. Now think about that. That's like getting an extra day in your week. So if you think you don't have time to do meditation, how about if you had 8 days in every week a month from now? That is the effect of um, doing meditation. So you have a way more time. We also found that their creativity rises dramatically. Their problem solving ability in some studies more than doubles. So here they're having these floods of positive emotion. Their creativity goes up, their productivity goes up. We also found on a 6 month follow up, their productivity went up even more. It was 26% after 6 months. So, yeah, you actually do not have the time not to meditate.
You make a fantastic case for that. That's undoubtedly. Um, you spoke about changes in the brain, actual physical changes in the brain that you can measure. And from what I'm recalling, you were highlighting different parts of the brain and those functions and they were getting larger. And so if those parts are getting larger, what's getting smaller in the brain?
Oh, what a fabulous question. So, our brains get smaller naturally as adults as we age. And every decade, after 30, after every decade, you lose about 5% of the mass of your brain. And neurons die and they aren't all replaced. And so your brain shrinks, very, very gradually, very small amounts every year. But if you add it up cumulatively between the age of 40 and the age of 85, the brain shrinks 25% on average. And that is a lot of brain shrinkage. If you have cognitive decline, if you have some form of senile dementia, if you have Alzheimer's disease, I have one really shocking image in chapter 2 of spiritual intelligence of accelerated brain shrinkage. And I have an image of two brains, and they're on the slab in a mortuary. Not a pretty picture. One is a normal human brain, great, great big brain, like the size of almost the size of a football. Then you have this little shrunken thing next to it. That's an Alzheimer's brain, an actual Alzheimer's brain, a photograph of both of them side by side. The Alzheimer's brain has shrunk by 70, not 17, 70%. So that's brain shrinkage, and it is severe. But what happens when we meditate is so interesting. And I close chapter 2 of spiritual intelligence with a landmark Alzheimer's study where the researchers took Alzheimer's patients who already had cognitive decline, already had brain shrinkage, and they measured their brains, volume of their brains, and their brains were getting smaller at an accelerated pace. Cognitive decline had set in. The the control group got one placebo thing to do. The control group, the experimental group, got a meditation that's a lot like eco meditation that involves certain breathing patterns, certain body postures, and they did that meditation half an hour for 6 months. And the researchers thought, well, we're hoping to see that their rate of cognitive decline goes down after meditation. We aren't sure if it will. Will their brain shrink a little bit less fast if they do the meditation for 6 months, half an hour a day? The results came back, and the researchers were stunned because the brains of the Alzheimer's patients had begun to grow. And certain regions like memory, learning, emotion regulation, top down executive control. I make a decision, I can control my emotions, I can control my life. Those parts of the brain got bigger in the Alzheimer's patients, and their rate of cognitive decline improved. So, this literally makes our brains grow. Now, certain parts of the brain do keep on shrinking. In long term meditators, the amygdala shrinks, and that's the brain's stress center. And in people with PTSD, stressed people, it grows. People who meditate a lot, it shrinks because you aren't turning on the stress centers all the time. So, there are certain parts that shrink, some parts that grow. And then the overall picture is that your brain is dramatically healthier after meditating for a while than if you don't. So, you're producing growth in these key parts of the brain when you meditate.
That's astounding. Just astounding that they would find that in those results. So thank you so much for sharing that and pointing that out. Um, what about the communication in the brain? Because is there a change in the function of the brain itself, not just physical?
Yeah, the way that the brain changes is quite dramatic. And in chapter one of Spiritual Intelligence, I outline the four brain regions that start to change and grow. So these four circuits are really key to our well-being. And these were discovered in the late 1990s by a really talented research team led by Richard Davidson at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. And what they found was in meditators, there are four distinct regions that begin to communicate better and begin to grow. And I recommend that people actually do conscious activities to develop all four of these regions. And the first of these circuits that I think is the most important to develop early on is emotion regulation. You want to be able to regulate your emotions. Like, if somebody cuts you off in traffic, or if there is that long line in the grocery store and you're feeling irritable, or, read the news and you're going to get stressed. So, can you regulate your emotions? Are you getting angry and annoyed and triggered? If you are, it's really hard to have a good life. So, you want to learn to dial down your emotions, and meditators get good at doing that. So, emotion regulation is the first circuit that I outline in chapter one, and also give you pointers to regulating that. Anthony Ray Hinton had fantastic emotion regulation. He had his parole being denied over and over and over again. People were keeping him in jail year after year after year, and he still wasn't getting angry. So he had that superb ability to regulate his emotions. Other people, they get a paper cut and the screaming and yelling. So makes a big difference to your life to develop emotion regulation. The second circuit that's big in meditators is attention. Meditators learn to pay attention. You're paying attention to your breath, to your mantra, to your image of a saint that you're enjoying looking at. So meditators learn to pay attention, and paying attention really helps you in life in all kinds of ways. And then after that circuit, we recommend that you really develop a circuit that dials down your obsession with self. We call that the selfing circuit, and most of us are really into ourselves. We think about things that we didn't like in the past, things we would prefer in the future. And so depressed people with major depressive disorder, that part of the brain is highly active, the selfing part of the brain. The more you're selfing, the more miserable you are. The two things go hand in hand. The more anxiety and depression you have, the more you're focused on yourself. These monks and nuns we study, meditators, they certainly have self-love, but they're compassionate. They're oriented toward other people, kindness, and they're also oriented toward the infinite, to cosmic consciousness. And so they are really other oriented in a way in which people who are selfing are not. So that's the third circuit, the circuit that controls that selfing. And then finally, the fourth of the four circuits, and again, we found a massive explosion in activity in this circuit after that month of eco meditation, is the empathy circuit. And empathy is just a kind of a shorthand for a bundle of positive emotions that include awe, gratitude, happiness, optimism, compassion. All of these things are mediated by the empathy circuit in our brains that was highly active in these people after a month. So those are the four circuits I outlined in chapter one, and then give you practical tools to actually develop each of those yourself, the result of which your level of joy, happiness, integration just goes through the roof.
A lot of people today are already empaths. They identify um, as being an empath, very sensitive to energy and things like this. And have we, or I should say, have you seen a shift just sort of baked in over all of the years you've been researching with people and how they operate just naturally? Maybe they meditate, maybe they don't. But I guess my question is the everyday person that we meet on the street, has there been a change in that just automatically?
Yeah, and that's where I go. So we know from research that in meditators, they become more compassionate as that empathy circuit kicks in, and that gets bigger and communicates better. And we know that their brains change very substantially over time. Once you meditated for 100 hours, now you really kicked off change in your brain. Now, after a few years, it's 1,000 hours you meditated. Now you're meditating while you sleep. Now, 8 hours a night, you're in a meditative state. Now your brain is changing even more. So we know that that compassionate, empathetic brain changes in individual meditators. We also know from big data, like the Center for Disease Control in the US collects data on what percentage of the American population meditates. And that number went up from 1% in 1980 to around 4% by around 2010 to around 17% by 2017. It's around 20% today. So 1% of people were changing their brains this way in 1980. 20% of people are doing that today. And that's why we see so many evidences in our society of increased compassion, like social changes that happen used to take centuries to happen. I mean, the abolition of slavery, women's rights. Those social changes took centuries to happen back along the historic timeline. But now we're seeing things like animal rights and gay marriage and legalization of marijuana, and all of these things happen really, really quickly based on a more compassionate society. So when you start to look for compassion, it's there all over the place. And the trend in our society, despite the news, is for increased compassion. And there's just a huge boatload of data to support that. So that's where I go in the last two chapters of the book about how we as a society are becoming more compassionate. And now the very first research has been published showing the effect of compassion, empathy on brain development. So new research is showing that people who are being born today actually have bigger brains, and they are bigger in those regions that have to do with empathy, compassion, and positive emotion. So it is a virtuous cycle where we're becoming a more compassionate society, and those compassionate brains are changing society, leading to mass evolutionary shift as we as a human race change our brain in large numbers of people.
It just is so hopeful, isn't it? All of these changes that we're talking about. And I could use some of that right now. I know a lot of us can with the uncertainty in the world. How do you view that? Because, I've read and heard people say that the world is in much better shape today than it ever has been. And I wonder if you have, a thought about that, because it maybe we're more plugged in to, all the things happening, and that sort of shades our judgment of that. But is the world a kinder, better place then?
Dramatically so, and the data shows that. And when we look at a news story, the analogy I use for that in chapter 6 of spiritual intelligence is a blanket. And if I have this blanket and I zoom in and look at one thread and I see, oh, this thread is red, then I'm very focused on that thread and I might think the whole blanket's red. When I zoom out, I see, oh no, this is a plaid blanket and there are 85 different colors in this blanket. So when I zoom out, I get the big picture. So when we look at an individual news story or the headlines of the day, one of the sayings in media is if it bleeds, it leads. And so they feed us this all these dramatic stories every day. There's something to rile us up, get us emotional, make us outraged. Now, a lot of those stories are true. I mean, there really is terrible massacres as we speak today happening in Gaza, and there's a terrible war happening in Ukraine, and there's a civil war happening in Sudan, and there are all these things going on that are terribly troubling and full of violence and injustice. And so we're looking at those threads when we look at those individual stories. When we zoom out, though, we see the whole picture, we see the whole blanket. And that's what science allows us to do. It allows us to get away from that when it bleeds, it leads individual story that we're looking at on the news to the big picture. What does the big picture tell us? The big picture tells us that global GDP, the average human being on the planet in all 200 plus countries, the average of all of their financial well-being has gone up threefold since 1980. The average global citizen is 3 times as wealthy as he or she was in 1980. The rest of the world, what we think of as the developing world, became about as rich as the uh, the rich world was in 1950, a few years ago. So 1950 isn't that long ago. My parents were alive then, and but based on my parents' lifetime. So we're seeing this huge increase in global well-being. Lifespan has doubled in the last century. Infectious diseases like polio and cholera and typhoid fever, all of these things have just disappeared in the last century. So there are massive global improvements. Wars between great powers have dropped dramatically over the last 500 years. Civil wars have dropped. The homicide rate, if you look at the homicide rate over the last 500 years, it dropped gradually. It's just been super low, like less than a hundredth of what it was in medieval times today. So there's all this big data that supports global thriving and well-being. That's just a sampling of 500 studies. Another example is deforestation, which I'm personally really worried about. But we are adding global forest cover. The two biggest countries, China and India, have dramatically added to have been reforesting like crazy. Norway's forest cover has gone up fourfold in the last century. NASA photographs of the entire Earth show that there's been a 5% increase in global forest cover since 2000. That's the equivalent of adding another Amazon rainforest to the planet. So, are there bad things going on? Absolutely. I'm not a Pollyanna. I'm not saying that all those stories, those little threads of the quilt, aren't true. They are. But zoom out to the big data for a perspective on the big picture going on, and you realize, oh, it's a multicolored quilt. There's a huge amount of good in the world, and there's this terrible suffering, and it's our job to be activists and do what we can to alleviate that.
So spiritual intelligence and activism can go together.
Absolutely. Definitely, because the old mystics of the Middle Ages, they just wanted to get out there and be in cosmic consciousness and live behind the walls of a monastery or a convent and just be in this infinite state of bliss. And it's wonderful to be out there. But for us today, we're in an existential crisis with climate change, and we need people who are engaged in the world around them. We need people who are parenting effectively. We need people who are bringing this to their work teams and their communities. And so the modern mystic is not called to be out there and be in the state of ecstasy and just have a wonderful time themselves. Now, it's great to do that for an hour every day or however long you meditate for, but then you want to come back and change your kid's diaper and file your taxes on time and give to good causes and volunteer at the homeless shelter and do all the other good things you possibly can do in the world. And that's the way we translate all of those values that we are in touch with cosmic consciousness. We then translate those into action in the world around us, and we make the world a much better place. So, for example, I've been involved for the last 15 years with the Veterans Stress Solution, bringing PTSD treatment free to tens of thousands of veterans. We've been training people in Ukraine, caregivers like therapists and school teachers in Ukraine for the last couple of years. So they have evidence-based techniques like eco-meditation and EFT to bring to people who are suffering there. So yeah, you want to be involved and do those things, and it's just joyful service to, again, translate those mystical experiences, have them feel wonderful, and then you do what you can to alleviate the suffering in the world around you.
The role of technology, cannot be, I think, understated or overstated. I don't know. I'm kind of in the zone with you here, Dawson. So my words aren't working. But what I'm trying to say is technology is amazing today. I mean, what is happening around the world, we know about in a millisecond, if we're looking, if we're plugged in, so to speak. And so that can be a negative right? If we're going to focus on the one thread, but the possibilities of us being engaged, being educated about what's going on, and then being able to teach others. Because I'm imagining you're teaching in all these countries and all these groups of people virtually in some cases. Yes. And 100 years ago, forget that. So what's the role? What do you see as far as the role and the interconnectedness of technology and spiritual intelligence and where we're going?
That is a fabulous question, Andrea. And there are a lot of people who are afraid of technology, and they're afraid, in particular, of AI. And AI really turbocharges every technology it's applied to. When you have AI vehicles, when you have AI surgery, when you have AI anything, AI dramatically leverages all technology. And so people are really worried about AI, about the pace of change. And what I find is missing from all of those conversations is the role of consciousness, because it's not the person um, just being acted on, it's the consciousness of that person as they use the technology. I mean, if you have a sharp knife, you can use it to make war or make salad. So there are lots of different uses for every technology, and it's the consciousness of people that is our high leverage point. As we see global consciousness changing, then the use they make of AI and other technologies is very, very different. They make creative use, they make kind use, they make compassionate, they make altruistic use of those technologies. And so trying to slow the rate of technological change or go back to a so-called simpler time in life when the technology wasn't there is just not going to happen. The pace of change is going to keep on accelerating. There'll be new technologies. What we can change is our brains and our minds and our perception and our values. And so you find if somebody is compassionate, they don't pollute, they aren't unkind to other people, they don't make war, they don't bully other people. So the origin point of consciousness is our high leverage point over technological change and over all kinds of social change as well. And that's why I feel spiritual intelligence is so much the answer to our global problems today. If people start to commune with the infinite, if they're in that place of love and bliss every morning before they start work, before they start school, before they start their day, they're then bringing all of those values into their workplace, their families, the world around them. And then they're using that technology to create a radically different world from the one we would otherwise have. So the last chapter, chapter 7, of spiritual intelligence is about where this takes us. What does law look like in the next 10, 20, 30 years when spiritual intelligence is in the picture? What does education look like? What does prison look like? What do all families, what do all of these communal experiences look like? What does healthcare look like? It's all going to change dramatically as spiritual intelligence begins to inform the development of all of those parts of society. So that's the really exciting picture I see ahead. It's going to change the world dramatically. And it's not going to change it in 100 years only. We're going to see changes showing up in the next year or two, and certainly in the next few decades.
Yeah, exciting is the word, right? When you started answering that question, I sort of went back to a few minutes ago in our conversation, because when you were talking about the changes that spiritual intelligence brings, one of the things that lit up for me was the word awareness, um, that emotional regulation type of idea. And when somebody cuts you off or they're going 10 miles an hour in a 25, kind of thing, you have that moment of, am I going to, how am I going to handle this at this time? And isn't that interesting? Because it's a function of our awareness, I think, because I think a lot of people who haven't done these kinds of practices, they just react, and then they find themselves in the emotion, overcome by the emotion. But as we progress, as we build our spiritual intelligence, what I'm hearing is, part of that is we gain awareness about how we're moving through our thoughts, how we're moving through our day, how we're moving through our relationships. And so we're beginning the path of the observer, perhaps. And that is so powerful, I think, in and of itself, because that can change your entire perspective on everything in your day.
Absolutely. And according to the former head of the Harvard Adult Development Project, which measures human development across the adult lifetime, that shift in perspective to the witness is the single biggest accelerator of personal growth. So if you're able to see yourself from the witness perspective, then suddenly you're a lot less reactive to things going on around you. You're seeing, like I do this sometimes when I'm say working with people and I'm in a difficult situation and I see, oh, there's Dawson getting triggered. How interesting. So now you've got the witness perspective, you're witnessing your own personality. And that means you aren't run by your own personality. You can say, oh, there's impatient Dawson. Interesting. Look at impatient Dawson there. I certainly do not have to act out impatient Dawson or put him in charge of my mouth or my keyboard. So you really shift into this witness perspective, and that produces a sense of detachment and a sense of agency in your life. And you can move much more creatively through your life if you have the witness. When we're really sucked into an emotion, like say somebody says something mean to us and we clench up and our gut gets hard, then you're small, you're tightly wound around your ego, tightly wound around your local individual personality. You don't have that witness perspective. But if you do simple meditative practices, when you're in that situation, take some deep breaths. If you know EFT tapping, tap gently on a few of the acupressure points. One of my favorite ones is the side of hand point. You just tap there, it regulates energy flows. When we hook people up to EEGs, we see that their emotions, which were really inflamed, the emotional brain was really active. Tapping on that point just calms the emotional brain. So you do something like that, and suddenly you aren't this little individual protective human ego at the mercy of your emotions. You can breathe, and you're this expansive being. You're seeing yourself from the witness perspective, and you then have choice. One of the men with whom one of my volunteers worked in San Quentin, he was on death row for murdering his wife and another man, and this young man who my friend and colleague was working with in San Quentin, um, he, before learning these stress reduction techniques, was highly reactive. In fact, he killed his wife because he caught her in bed with another man, and he killed them both. And he was like, well, I caught her in bed with somebody else, I killed him, of course. Like in prison, he got into fights often. He said, he'd explain to my volunteer, he'd say, well, the guy dissed me, so I hit him. To him, that was just a straight line. This happened, therefore this. So no emotion regulation consideration whatsoever. Just simply a straight line between the guy saying something and me hitting him. After he learned tapping, after he learned meditation, just after a couple of sessions, didn't take long, suddenly he steps back into the witness and he says, oh, the guy dissed me, said something disrespectful to me, and I realized I have a choice. I have options. I have several options. I can walk away. I can turn around. I can make a joke. I can blah, just a number of things he can do. I don't have to hit him. So you move into the witness perspective, and the range of options you have opens up. Now, you and I aren't in San Quentin on death row for murder, but we are reactive, and we have situations in our life all the time where A happens, we react with B. When you are in the witness perspective, you have a wide range of options. And as you're listening right now, think about, where are you reacting? Were you sucked into that clenching, being small and wound around your precious ego? Where do you need to take a deep breath, do eco meditation, do some tapping, step back, move into the witness perspective? And when you do, you'll discover you have so many options. You do not have to react. And again, that is emotion regulation. And we see that circuit start to get bigger. Again, it's called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. In chapter 1 of Spiritual Intelligence, I explain how it grows when you do this. It gets bigger, and it's like bench pressing 200 pounds. You start to have an enormous ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and you can regulate all of those emotions. The other super cool thing that you get as a bonus for building up that neural tissue is once that emotion control knob gets big and you can dial down negative emotions, it occurs to you at a certain point, and this is a fun moment for meditators, when you realize you can turn the dial in the opposite direction. So, for example, I feel pleasure. Gee, let's use the emotion regulation circuit to dial up the pleasure. So, when I see a beautiful sunset, I'll stand there and stare and just drink in the colors, notice the fine details of the sunset. When I smell a rose, when I have a wonderful, pleasurable experience, I will savor it. Now you're using that same piece of tissue, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, to dial up positive emotion as well as dial down negative emotion. And your life just becomes unbelievably good. We find that the happiness level of people doing this goes through the roof. So it's an amazing thing to develop these kinds of abilities. Being in the witness gives you all these additional options.
I have long felt and even witnessed, using that word, but in the field of Reiki, I started with it in 1995, and I've seen so many changes, not only in myself, but in students. And when we offer sessions to other people, and they're not meditating, they're just receiving, but yet the benefits are very similar to meditation. Can you speak about that when we engage with energy work or healing work? Is what's the overlap, or is there?
Energy changes matter. Matter is at its fundamental level energy. And so in string theory holds that even things we see as solid matter, like atoms, are actually very small strings or packets of energy. Everything is energy, and it only condenses into matter at a certain point. So when we change our energy, we heal, we feel better. And meditation will change your energy, but energy work, like Reiki and other forms of energy, Jo Ray, energy medicine, they will change your energy, and people just heal. I was working with somebody recently, and this woman had a traumatic brain injury 15 years earlier. So 15 years she's been dealing with, had a concussion, was spun around and hit her head, and she has been having a hard time even walking because her brain can't regulate her proprioception effectively. So she sees two floors. She sees the real floor and another floor, and can't tell which is the right one. Doesn't know how to walk effectively. Has to really train herself, just focus, just to walk. So 15 years of traumatic brain injury, and so there I'm sitting with her now. Logically, you think, how can this guy sitting with somebody with a traumatic brain injury and tapping on acupuncture points to change the energy, how can that possibly work? Well, it did. We changed the energy, and her physical body changed, and she felt all of that brain fog that had held her back and stopped her from seeing where the floor was just go away. And it's just remarkable to see how energy changes matter. So I always advocate to people, when you're sick, when you're having a limitation, when you're in a crisis, sure, by all means, change the material circumstances if you need to, but focus first on energy. How can I change my energy toward this person, toward the situation, toward money, toward my relationships, toward my community, toward my job? Focus on energy first, and then also look for material cures. So there are many things that change energy. Time in nature has an epigenetic effect. Genes are utterly material, the DNA, and they change when we spend time in nature. Tapping changes gene expression. It changes over 70 genes in an hour. There's research showing it changes many genes. when you tap. Meditation changes things as physical as the aging markers in every cell in your body. It expands your aging markers, making you younger when you meditate. All these things, they're energy based, and they change matter. Does that mean we never need any material matter-based interventions like drugs or surgery? No, we have drugs and surgery too, and we can use them appropriately as needed and focus on how energy can change you. So Reiki's doing that, EFT's doing that, meditation's doing that, time in nature's doing that, grounding is doing that, hugs, just social connection, being kind to other, compassion is one of the things that changes your brain the most, changes the matter of your brain the most. Just being loving and kind and compassionate, that's going to have a powerful effect on your neurophysiology. So that's the commonality, is when you change energy, matter changes too.
What a wonderful conversation, Dawson. Speaking about your book, what is your hope for what people get out of the book? I mean, in a nutshell, what is the main takeaway?
The main takeaway is in chapter 1, and it is the hardware in your brain are those 4 circuits. Everybody has an attention circuit. Everyone has an emotion regulation circuit. Everyone has the empathy circuit and the self control circuit. In most people, it's like a dark room with the lights turned off. They just haven't turned them on. So what I want to inspire people to do is just switch this stuff on. You have this ecstatic wiring in your head already. You were born with it. You don't have to go anywhere to find it or develop it. It's right there. But for goodness sake, do not go to the grave with it turned off the whole time. Don't live in the darkness your whole life. Turn it on. You have all this machinery of bliss inside your head. Just turn it on and live a fantastic life. So that's really, it's this hardware, and how easy it is. Again, 30 days and we see structural change in the brain. If you do it for prolonged periods of time, we see changes even in Alzheimer's brains. So it's going to shift your brain. That's going to shift your life. And that's really what I want people to understand. And also that spiritual intelligence is something that transcends religion, transcends culture, and is making the world a better place already. We're all part of this movement toward spiritual intelligence. It transcends race, it transcends politics, it transcends culture, it transcends history, and we all can develop this ability to connect to something greater than ourselves. When we do, it changes our lives dramatically. When it changes your life, it changes the life of everyone around you and ultimately society, and leads us to a much more enlightened world as well. So those are sort of the big points I make in the book, as well as practices. Every chapter ends with a section called Extended Play Resources and Deepening Practices. And I give you links to free meditations there and free videos there and many resources you can use to actually apply and develop your own spiritual intelligence. So it's an intensely practical book, and I'm just convinced that spiritual intelligence, like emotional intelligence was for the 90s, spiritual intelligence is the skill we as individuals and society need for this point in history. And it's a movement that is going to sweep the world and radically change both individuals and society.
Empowerment, individual empowerment, and to give them the tools like that right there in the book. What could be better? I mean, all they have to
Agreed.
do is say yes and spend a little bit of time every day. And that is truly remarkable, Dawson. And I understand you're going to hang out with me a little extra after this episode. We're going to do a little something special for the BTRG Insiders, and can't wait for that. So before we sign off and make that for those special fans, I want to give you the opportunity to share. How can people contact you? How can they learn more? And if you could point them in the right direction, that would be fantastic.
Oh, I love doing that, because we want to take action on these things we learn. It's one thing to be inspired, but then to actually apply those things in your life, That's where the rubber meets the road. That's what makes a difference in your life, to actually do that meditation. So start by going to the book's website and ordering the book, spiritualintelligencebook.com. Don't forget the book part at the end, spiritualintelligencebook.com, and you'll get some bonuses there, and you'll get your copy of Spiritual Intelligence. So grab that. You'll also get the first 2 chapters as a download right away. So you can start reading immediately before your book arrives. So get the book, and at spiritualintelligencebook.com, I'll also then offer you a series of free meditations. You'll find that there are meditations that help you with various parts of your life and developing those 4 circuits. So start with spiritualintelligencebook.com, explore further, explore other forms of healing, explore EFT, explore meditation, find what really works for you. There are people who need different things. Some people really benefit from sitting meditation. Others prefer moving meditation, like a dance or yoga or qigong. Find the practices that work for you and then apply those in your life. But at spiritualintelligencebook.com, you'll find links to many different resources there. Explore them, and then be uncompromising about your own well-being. Don't listen to this and say, oh, how nice. What a lovely conversation that Dawson and Andrea had. And go about your day. Apply this in your life. Meditate every day. After you download that meditation, meditate every day for 30 minutes a day. Just make that your baseline, like those Alzheimer's patients did, and saw their brains change. And what we found with people doing that is measurable anatomical change of the brain in 30 days. You will have a healthier, younger brain, and it'll only take you a month. So apply this in your life, and that's really my passion for seeing people apply these things. All of their lives open up from that. When you're in touch with your higher power, when you're one with the all that is, suddenly your life has meaning and purpose and love in a way which it wouldn't have before. So that's all available to you through that single link, spiritualintelligencebook.com.
Thank you so much, Dawson. What a joy it's been to get to talk to you like this. As I said when we first came on, I just feel like I know you. You're so easy to talk to, and just it's a joy. So thank you so much
What
for
a
being
pleasure.
here.
I love sharing. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, it's Andrea. If you've ever felt a nudge to learn Reiki with me, this might be our moment. I'm coming over to the UK this June, and I'll be teaching a Reiki 1 and 2 class, and then a Reiki master class will be at the beautiful French Partridge Hotel near Northampton. I'm also including for my students a special exclusive event, and we'll share some time together outside of class, and I think that you'll like it very much. I also know that the world feels uncertain right now, and it may be easy to hesitate and put this sort of thing off. But this is exactly when we need to invest in ourselves and take action, because how we grow now will shape how we'll support ourselves and others later. This is no time to sit on the sideline. Spots are limited, and both the classes are now at least halfway full. Go to mainstreamreiki.com to reserve your seat, to learn more about both classes and that exclusive bonus event. I truly hope to see you in June. Thank you for listening, and you can check the show notes or visit the website beyondthereikigateway.com to find out more about the podcast and connect with me. Please keep in mind that views and opinions expressed in the show don't necessarily reflect those of the podcast or anyone affiliated with its production or advertising. This program is presented for your entertainment only, and all information provided is to be utilized at the listener's own discretion. I, along with the BTRG team, hope you enjoy the show as much as we enjoy making it for you. Wishing you highest blessings until we meet again beyond the Reiki Gateway.